Okay, we'll get started, and the live video will join us a little later today. Good afternoon to everyone. Always a pleasure to be learning together. This is Safi Razman, and this class, I believe, is the final session, the fourth and final session of Law and Practice in Early Judaism with Dr. Malka Simkovich. Just a reminder that if you receive an invitation to become a panelist and you accept it, that would allow you to unmute and participate when questions or comments are welcome, which I believe in this class will be throughout the class. And also just a reminder to stay muted when you're not actively speaking. I will also help mute you, which means that you would have to remember to unmute so we can hear you when you next speak again. Also, you can participate here via chat on Zoom or as a comment on Facebook. With that, I'll turn this to you, Dr. Simkovich.
Thank you very much. Good to see all of you, or some of you. And this is the fourth in our four-part series on law and early Judaism. So hopefully we'll wrap up some things, address your outstanding questions, and leave some time at the end of the hour for discussion. On the syllabus, you will see that today is designated for conversation about temple. And this is an especially pertinent question, having now established that the majority of Jews in the Second Temple era actually do not live in proximity to the temple. They live all over the Hellenistic world, in North Africa, on Greek islands, in eastern regions of the empire where the Jews were exiled centuries earlier, in Italy, in Antioch to the north. And the question of how these Jews related to the temple is a matter of live and active debate. I am going to take a particular position in this debate, but you should know that there isn't scholarly consensus about the extent to which Jews are devoted and loyal to the Jerusalem temple, especially those who are not in proximity to it. Now, I want to back up a little bit and just review what we discussed last week and 2 weeks ago. We've been talking about the identifying markers of Jewish identity in the ancient world. When it comes to non-sectarian Judaism, which is 99.2% of Jews in the ancient world, we are talking about Shabbat, dietary law, and circumcision. These are the big three identifying markers of Jewish practice. And then on top of that, the regular gathering together to read and interpret the scriptures on Shabbat and maybe even during the week. That's common Judaism. Sectarian Judaism, as we noted last week, is a little bit different. There's a heightened focus on purity, and that concern pervades all things. And instead of thinking about the three identifying markers of Jewish practice being Shabbat, dietary law, and circumcision, I suggested that we think about Shabbat or calendar, food, which includes not only what's in your kitchen, but also the kind of food that you're bringing to the temple, food in various aspects, and then also the cultic practice. So Shabbat, food, and temple, I think, are the concerns of many or all of the sects that we looked at last week. Now, even for Jews who are not sectarian, who are practicing what we would call common Judaism, the temple, I think, is hugely important for most of these Jews. Again, there's a big controversy over the particular role of the temple for these Jews, and we have ancient sources that conflict with one another, and that's what makes the question so complex. For example, we know that there was a temple tax, a didrachmon. We know that Jews were supporting the temple financially. Josephus talks about it. Now, Josephus, of course, was reared in the land of Israel. He's writing from Rome, but he's knowledgeable about this, maybe because he's from Judea. But Philo of Alexandria also talks about this temple tax. Ultimately, and you can look up some of the scholarship yourself, we don't know who paid this tax. So the utility of knowing about this tax is limited. Who exactly paid it, how it was paid, we don't have the details of this tax. It's mentioned in the New Testament as well. But we have, again, all kinds of conflicting evidence that suggests both that Jews outside the land of Israel are deeply devoted to the temple, and also maybe that they were just fine without it. So before we look at some of these sources, we are going to go back to the beginning. Let's look at some biblical sources and see what the Tanakh has to say about the temple, and especially about pilgrimage, because pilgrimage is becoming a hugely important thing. It becomes very central to the early Jesus community. And the question is, people ask me this all the time, how many Jews made pilgrimage on the pilgrimage holidays? On Sukkot and Pesach and Shavuot, were Jews really going to the temple? Were all of them going? Were some of them going? So this is going to be a major focus of the next 30 or 40 minutes. And let's begin by looking at some biblical sources. So I'm going to share my screen very reluctantly as usual, but let's do it. Okay. All right. Now I have to see you. Okay. So the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, is very clear, right? It says, go on pilgrimage. Now, of course, the presumption in Shemot and Devarim is that all the people are going to be living in the land of Israel. I don't usually do sources inside. This is for your reference. But you know these sources. These are famous, right? 3 times a year, the men in your community should appear before the Lord your God, right? The place of his choosing. And then it names the pilgrimage festivals. They shouldn't appear empty-handed. They should bring sacrifices, etc. So it's very clear. But again, there is a presumption that all Jews are living in one place, and that place is in relative proximity to the Jerusalem temple. So on a practical level, we really don't know whether all Jews did this, right? By the Second Temple period, when Jews are living all over the Hellenistic world, and before that, the Persian world, was pilgrimage a part of their lives? And many of my Catholic students, by the way, who view pilgrimage as something that is very, very important to early Christian identity, just assume that wherever you lived, if you were a Jew, if you were a practicing Jew, of course you went on pilgrimage. Probably that's not the case. So let's look at some evidence, and you're going to see exactly what I mean when I suggest that it's very contradictory. Let's start. I'm because of time concerns, you see that I added to the source sheet that I sent to Drisha this morning. I always do that. And I am happy to send you this updated source sheet if you send me an email at msimkovich@ctu.edu. I'm not going to spend time on this first section. The point is that there are sectarian Jews and other Jews living in the land of Israel who really center their religious identity on the integrity and the purity and the protection of the temple. So the temple is not merely a place that you go to worship your God, but it's a place that requires care and dignity, and it's incumbent upon the community to protect the temple. And so when the temple is violated, of course, it's considered a horrific thing, and it also in the ancient world represents some kind of violation of the deity as well. Although maybe not in the same way. When we're talking about the Jerusalem temple, of course, it's very clear that God is the ruler of the universe. So we could talk about how that is different from other ancient Near Eastern communities. But I'm putting this aside. Okay, I'm not focusing on this section. This section is just about the centrality of the temple for Jerusalem writers who are concerned with its purity. I want to focus on pilgrimage, and I want to focus on the diasporan Jewish community of the 3rd and 2nd and 1st centuries BCE. And I'm going to start with a novella, a very entertaining novella. It's preserved in the Apocrypha, and it is the story of Tobit, Tovia. Has anybody heard of Tobit? Okay, so the novella of Tobit was written in Hebrew by an observant Jew living in the land of Israel in the late 3rd century BCE. It's a fantastically entertaining tale. There's separated lovers, and there's a journey, and there's lost treasure, and there's angels. There's all kinds of fun action in Tobit. It's preserved in the Apocrypha, which means it's part of the Catholic canon. And it was not, it's cited a little bit in later rabbinic literature, but it's not preserved as an authoritative book by any means in Jewish tradition. So many Jews do not know this book. What's interesting for our purposes is that the writer describes the hero, Tobit. I think I made mention of this in previous weeks, or I was in some class where I was talking about Tobit recently. And Tobit self-describes as someone who goes on pilgrimage. He talks about his own piety in terms of pilgrimage. So he says, I came from the tribe of Naphtali. Now, this is a late 3rd century BCE book, but the author sets the story in the period of the Assyrian exile in the 8th century BCE. Again, we can read this as fictional, but the writer is expressing real values, and we can look for those and take those seriously as historical fantasy. And Tobit tells us, I alone went often to Jerusalem for the festivals, as it is prescribed for all Israel by an everlasting decree. So, according to the author, right, I don't think that we can read this book and say, oh, we have evidence that people were doing this. But the author is espousing a value. And the value is that the most pious Jews express their piety by going on pilgrimage and affirming that this is a requirement that applies to all Jews forever and ever, wherever they live. So Tobit says, I would hurry up to Jerusalem with the first fruit of the crops, right? All the tithes of the cattle, the first shearing, and I would go and I would offer all these things to the sons of Levi, to the priests who ministered at Jerusalem. So there's a big chunk of the section in which he's talking about how pious he is. So maybe he's not very humble. And he does so in this context of pilgrimage. Now, again, is this historical evidence? No, this is literature, but it does tell us something about the values of the Judean author. So we can read it as a kind of fantasy, a wish fulfillment. How does the author want Jews who live far from the temple to interact with the temple? But this doesn't really tell us that Jews were going on pilgrimage, right? It's I'm trying to think of a contemporary metaphor, but it's like the same way that a Jew in Israel might say, well, every Jew in the diaspora is Zionist, of course, because all Jews outside of Israel care about Zionism. So, that might be great if it was true, but it's more of a fantasy than a reality, perhaps. Okay, so let's look for real evidence. And we find this evidence. We find, again, we can debate whether this is evidence, but we find what looks to be historical evidence for pilgrimage from a treatise composed by the great philosopher Philo of Alexandria, who lives from around 20 BCE to 50 CE. Philo elsewhere tells us that he visited the Jerusalem temple once. He saw it with his own eyes. He witnessed its grandeur. He has great reverence for the temple. And nevertheless, he is a Jew living in Alexandria who chooses not to move to Israel. It was not an impossible journey in the early 1st century, and it certainly was not impossible for Jews to relocate permanently from Egypt to Judea. He doesn't do that, but he does visit the temple and he does admire it. And the way that he describes pilgrimage in Jerusalem is absolutely fascinating. So I want to take a look at what he says in a treatise called The Special Laws, which is a treatise of interpretation where Philo goes through laws that might have less self-evident rationales in the biblical tradition. All right, so this is what Philo says. Philo is talking about Moses, right? Moses provided a rule that there should not be temples built in many places or many in the same place, right? There should just be one temple, and that's the temple in Jerusalem. Now you have to also understand, and I'm going to ruin the surprise, Philo is writing this at a time when there is at least one Jewish temple standing in Egypt. So we know that there are Jewish temples in Egypt in the Second Temple era. And Philo apparently does not accept their legitimacy. Okay, so Philo continues. Moses did not consent to those who wish to perform the rites in their houses, right? These are the bamot, the famous bamot. We find them in Sefer Malachim, right? The Jews are built, or the Israelites, the Judeans are building these backyard altars, and the prophets rail against them. You cannot worship your God at these bamot. You have to go to the Jerusalem temple, right? And Moses says, get up, right? Don't be lazy and come from the ends of the earth, right? Go wherever you live. It doesn't matter. There's no boundaried limitation. It's not only for Jews in the land of Israel. It's for everyone. So Philo was reading into the scriptural tradition the understanding that there will come a time when Jews don't all live in the land of Israel. Now, is that the pshat of Shemot or Devarim, right? Should we read Shemot and Devarim as understanding that one day all the Jews will be dispersed? I'm not convinced by that. I think that Devarim especially is imagining a society of Israelites in the land and only in the land. But Philo says no. Wherever they live, even if they're at the ends of the earth, they have an obligation to come to this temple, right? For one who's not going to sacrifice in the religious spirit would never bring himself to leave his country and his friends and his kinsfolk and sojourn in a strange land unless, they're really, really pious. Okay, and that's exactly what they do. Philo describes this, and I can't help but laugh at this description, and I'll tell you afterwards why it makes me laugh. All right, this is the description of pilgrimage. Countless multitudes of Jews from countless cities all over the world, some over land, right? They come to Jerusalem, some by sea, east and west and north and south at every feast. He's not necessarily talking about Hanukkah and Purim, but Sukkot, Pesach, and Shavuot. They take the temple from their port as a general haven and a safe refuge from the bustle and the great turmoil of life. Like any good Alexandrian philosopher, Philo thinks that the city is corruptive, right? He thinks that you can't get your mind clear in the city. There's too much distraction. There's too much commerce, too much mercantile, vanity. You have to get away from the hustle and bustle, the rat race, to really connect to God, to really connect to yourself. And there the Jews seek to find calm weather and released from the cares whose yoke has been heavy upon them from their earliest years. These Jews, again, who come to Jerusalem, enjoy a brief breathing space in scenes of genial cheerfulness. Thus filled with comfortable hopes, they devote the leisure, as is their bounden duty, to holiness and the honoring of God. Friendships are formed. This is like summer camp, but like a very calm, sleepy summer camp. Friendships are formed between those who hitherto knew not each other, and the sacrifices and libations are the occasion of reciprocity of feeling and constitute the surest pledge that all are of one. All right, so why do I find this really, really striking? And maybe I'll just stop my share for a second. This is a really striking and problematic, maybe, description of pilgrimage. Why do I say that? Yes, please, Sarah.
Have we ever known all Jews to be united and agreeing on anything?
It's very idyllic. It's very idyllic. And also look at I'll share my screen again so you could take a look if you don't have it in front of you, but look at the calm tranquility. Now, like Sarah said, imagine hundreds of thousands of Jews bringing hundreds of thousands of animals to be slaughtered, right? Imagine the blood, imagine the sounds, and imagine the smell. This is incredibly chaotic. Josephus tells us that. We have other literary, evidence that talks about the chaos, but the great chaos, the crowds, the tumultuous jostling, right? There's nothing tranquil about this pilgrimage, right? He says, they devote their leisure to holiness, friendships are formed. I imagine someone like sipping a mocktail on the beach, watching the dulcet waves. This is not the situation on the ground. It's fascinating that Philo wants to conjure an image of total tranquility. And also he's saying, easily to 500,000 people in the city, right? Countless multitudes from countless cities. All right, Sarah, yes.
So I want to go back to the first texts. In Exodus, there's actually no mention of the temple, at least in the portion that you showed us. And Deuteronomy was written after the temple was built and the cultic practices were invoked by someone. So it was probably retrofitted to be descriptive rather than proscriptive.
I'm not going to talk about the dating of Deuteronomy because that's not my field. But definitely there is a vagueness. Of course, we know the land of Israel is not really named, when we talk about establishing a society. of these Israelites. In most of the Torah, we don't actually have the land named, but I think there is a very clear and unambiguous expectation that there's one center, right? There's one temple, there's one center, and they're all going to gather at that, right? And then, of course, you have this like culminating scene of the king reading the Torah to all the people. So there's an expectation of unity. Now we can debate, is there an understanding that this is Jerusalem, or is this, wherever they end up? But I think what's really interesting is that it doesn't seem to accommodate for a reality of dispersion. That's all I'll say about it. Yeah. Okay, so let's go back to, all right, so Tyler's just funny. And clearly polemical, right? Because he's talking to a Greek-speaking audience that he assumes has never been to Jerusalem, has never seen this with their own eyes, and he really wants to convey a certain kind of sophistication to his audience. Like, look at how sophisticated. Now, Jews are being accused of barbarism. They're being accused of being too antiquated, of worshiping this ancestral god in a temple that they don't allow non-Jews to enter. And so they're not only insular and misanthropic, but they're also secretive and elitist. And Paul says, oh no, you have it all wrong. We go and we're all, sitting there in friendship and in, it's sort of, it's this like very philosophically minded experience. Now, it's not quite the description that you have in other texts. And let's take a look at, gosh, I never know whether the share option, I never know whether it's going to share my notes or not. So, all right, so here we go. So let's look at Josephus's Antiquities. Now, I'm not going to do this line for line, but the point is there are a few interesting things about the many, many passages in Josephus where he talks about pilgrimage. In Antiquities 4, he's describing the biblical mandate for the Jews, for the Israelites to come on pilgrimage. But in this early book, remember, Antiquities has 20 volumes, and it's a biblical, it's a retelling of the people's history starting from Genesis. So it covers biblical history, and then it goes past it all the way up until the 1st century. And interestingly, Josephus seems to limit the mandate of pilgrimage to those who live in the land of Israel. So as he's, and this actually goes a little bit to what Sarah says, that maybe he was troubled by the fact that it's not clear where the people are supposed to be. Josephus clarifies, let those that live even as remote as the bounds of the land. In other words, up until the edge of the land, even those who are kind of far, let's say, up in the Galilee, by the Yam Kinneret, up until the boundaries of the land, which the Hebrews shall possess, they should come to that city where the temple shall be 3 times a year. So Josephus obviously knows that in his day, Jews are coming to the temple from all over the world, but he understands that the biblical mandate doesn't accommodate for that kind of dispersion. At the same time, later in Antiquities, Josephus is very careful to clarify the widespread devotion that Jews, wherever they live, have for the land of temple. And in one of the most fascinating passages in Antiquities, Josephus says the following. Everybody complains about the temple, and everybody wonders, why is this temple so important to the Jews? And Josephus says as follows: let no one wonder that there was so much wealth in our temple. All the Jews throughout the habitable earth, and those that worshiped God, even those in Asia and Europe, because remember, Europe is the backwaters. Northern Europe is like, nobody goes to Northern Europe if you're in the Roman Empire. It's a backwaters. But even on the edges of the Roman Empire, even those Jews who are out of the way send their contributions to the temple, and this from very ancient times. And he quotes the 1st century BCE Roman writer Strabo, who essentially says wherever you go in the Roman world, you can find a synagogue. And even these Jews who are going to synagogues in the Second Temple period are supporting the Jerusalem temple. Now, Josephus might have been aware that, oh my gosh, why am I blanking on the name? Cicero in around 59 BCE delivers a speech to the Roman Senate advocating for a banning of the export of gold from Jewish communities in Egypt to Jerusalem. So much gold is being sent from these Jewish communities to Jerusalem. Cicero says this money should be going to support the Jupiter temple in Rome. We have to stop the Jews from sending so much money to Jerusalem. So we know from Josephus and from Cicero, Jews are sending money. Now,
Dr. Simkovich, just a quick question from the chat. Joyce is asking, do we have an idea how many days the journey from Babylonia or Egypt to Jerusalem would take in ancient times?
well, I don't. That's a great question. But coming from Babylonia would be much, much, much harder than coming from Egypt. Because Babylonia, first of all, not only is it farther, let's say, just look at a map. You could look at the Euphrates, you could look at the Tigris. It's also you're crossing mountain ranges. So it's a more dangerous, it's a more arduous, risky journey. Crossing the Sinai Desert, I don't know, 10 days? I don't know. I can't even imagine it was more than that. I guess it depends how fast a camel goes, but it's not an impossible journey. People did it all the time. Yeah, so I'd have to look that up. It's a good question. But going to Babylonia was a much bigger deal. Maybe less than it couldn't have been 10 days. That's so long. Couple days. You're crossing the Sinai Desert. So I don't know. But going to Babylonia was a very big deal, and that was hard for people to do. Okay. All right. So let's go to Josephus. Okay. So now Josephus gives an example of one particular year that was catastrophic in Jerusalem because of the number of people who were in the city. And this is 69 CE. He says the reason why so many captives were taken by Rome, he says 97,000, it was probably less. Josephus inflates his numbers, but that's the number he gives us. And he says the reason why there were so many Jews taken captive by Rome is because that spring and into the summer, there were Jews who came to the region to celebrate the Passover holiday. And so Josephus tells us the number of those that were carried captive during this whole war was collected to be 97,000, as was the number of those that perished during the whole siege, 1,100,000, right? The greater part of whom were indeed of the same nation. They were Jews, but they were not residents of the city itself. For they were come up from the country, they had come up from all the country and maybe beyond. But here he just says they came up from all the country for the feast of unleavened bread. And then they found themselves stuck in the city. All of a sudden, they were shut up by the army, right? And you can imagine the disastrous situation they found themselves in because there are hundreds of thousands of Jews who are visitors, right? And now there's this pestilential destruction among them and then a famine because they find themselves stuck in the Roman siege. And this is why the siege, according to Josephus, is so incredibly disastrous. It's because the city was bursting at the seams with pilgrims. This is a very fascinating piece of evidence that Jews, in fact, were coming up, at least for Passover, for Pesach, on pilgrimage to the city. And many of those were caught in this horrible catastrophe and were killed or taken captive. Now, in my opinion, this source is much more reliable than Philo, although Philo in his own way is fascinating. But I think that this passage is maybe the best piece of evidence that we have from the first century that Jews were coming from Alexandria, Antioch, elsewhere on pilgrimage. But it's really not clear because Josephus says that they came from all the country. So, at the end of the day, there is open debate about how to understand this. Josephus obviously doesn't have a list of, who these people are and where they come from. And so we simply don't have academic consensus on the numbers. Now, we have some really interesting archaeological evidence. For example, the Biblical Archaeology Review years ago had a fascinating piece on pilgrimage roads to Jerusalem. These roads were rather wide, but not so wide as to accommodate chariots, right? So like the real Roman highways, those were really wide because they were built for chariots. These were walking roads, but they were walking roads to accommodate families. They weren't like a sidewalk, but there's a presumption. It's really incredible. I have to find this article because I don't know. I don't think I have it on my desktop, but I could probably find it online. So there were a couple meters wide with a presumption that families of 4 or 5 or 6 would be walking alongside one another. And we have these roads coming from different directions, which is so fascinating. So we have sometimes the archaeological evidence, oftentimes, is more compelling than the literature because the literature is often aspirational, right? What do we want the world to look like? But archaeology is very tangible. In addition to the roads, we also have a very famous inscription. And the inscription was found in Jerusalem, and it comes from the early Common Era. It's known as the Theodotus or Theodotus inscription. And this is what it says. So this was an inscription that was found. All right, I'll just read it to you. Okay, Theodotus, the son of Betinus, priest and archisynagogos. Archisynagogos means the head of the synagogue. This is not an unusual word. The archisynagogos, the synagogue head, was not exactly like a rabbi, but some kind of maybe like synagogue president in the ancient world. And Theodotus, who was the son of this other Jew, a priest and an archisynagogos, and the son of an archisynagogos, and the grandson of an archisynagogos. It's like that famous guy who asks his rabbi if he could be a priest, a Kohen, because my father was a Kohen, my father's father is a Kohen. So this very impressive individual, he built the synagogue for the reading of the Torah. That is not a good translation. Again, I actually should have clarified. I'm pretty sure this is in Greek. So it would be nomos, and for the teaching of the commandments. And he built the strangers' lodging, the chambers, and the water fittings as an inn for those that needed from abroad, of which synagogues his fathers and the elders and Simonides did lay the foundation. In other words, you have this ancient synagogue, and you have attached to it rooms. And what are the rooms for? They're for the pilgrims. They're for the visitors. They're for people who are coming to Jerusalem to bring sacrifices at the temple, presumably on these pilgrimage holidays. So you have some really interesting evidence that Jews were coming. They were not staying. So how pious were they? We could debate that in a contemporary context. Certainly, the Jews, they feel very connected to the land of Israel. They come and then they leave. They go back home. And I say that as someone who is going to Israel for the summer, and I'm going back to Chicago. But there is this sense of connection, but we don't have evidence of a mass aliyah, right? We don't have evidence of a wave of emigration from regions like Alexandria of Jews who move and they settle permanently. I haven't found anything that testifies to that, but they feel something. They're sending money, they're supporting the temple, they're visiting it, there's a connection. Now I want to talk about all the evidence that undermines what I just said, but first let's pause for any questions. Any questions? All right, so now can I contradict everything that I just said and talk about all the ways in which the Jews actually maybe weren't connected to the temple? Okay, bye, Sarah. Sarah has a conflict. All right. So let's go back. Let's go back and take a look at some other sources. Now, I'm going to skip 2 Maccabees, but I want you to know that 2 Maccabees is a diasporan book. In other words, it's written by a very pious Jew who lives in North Africa in modern day Libya, in a place called Cyrene, where there were many, many Jews up until the early 2nd century. Then they were probably all killed out by Trajan. But the author of 2 Maccabees is writing the late 2nd century BC. He writes an account of the Hasmonean rebellion using sources that he has. He is not an eyewitness. 1 Maccabees is an eyewitness. The author of 2 Maccabees is not. And the original work was written by a Jew named Jason. And I can't tell you his Hebrew name because I don't know what it was. I don't know what most Jasons were in Hebrew. There might be an answer to that. I don't have it. And this 5-volume work by Jason was lost. What we have today, the 2 Maccabees we have today, is a condensed version of that older 5-volume work. But what's so intriguing about 2 Maccabees is that although it's written in Greek, whereas 1 Maccabees is written in Hebrew. And although it's diasporan, whereas 1 Maccabees is Judean, it is obsessed with the temple. And it says the word temple many, many, many times. And it really frames the story of the Hasmonean rebellion as a story about recovering the integrity and the purity of the temple. And you can see that in the opening verses. This is the story of the purification of the great temple, the dedication of the altar. Everything before chapter 2, verse 19 are letters that were added to the book later. 2 Maccabees is a complicated text, but this is actually the beginning of the book, the condensed version that we have. And he says, I'm just condensing Jason's 5-volume work because it was so long, and unfortunately we lost that book. So 2 Maccabees is temple obsessed, but we're going to put that aside because I want to spend the remainder of this class on Egyptian Jewish temples. Now, I just showed you some sources that make it pretty clear that many Jews were going on pilgrimage. Now, we don't exactly know the numbers, and we don't exactly know where they were coming from, but we have the archaeological evidence and we have the literary evidence that this was happening. And at the same time, Jews are not just building synagogues in Egypt. They're building temples. And they don't do this out of any kind of self-understanding of heresy. To these Jews, these are acts of homage. In fact, we'll see with the temple at Leontopolis, which was built in the early 2nd century BCE. I actually don't know if I included this source, but Josephus preserves a letter that the founder, the builder of this temple, Onias, who came from Jerusalem, he was a priest from Jerusalem, escaping some corrupt Hellenized priests. Onias wrote the Egyptian king Ptolemy. He asked him for permission to build a Jewish temple in the 170s BCE. And he says, this temple is an act of homage to the Jerusalem temple. We will build it in the same dimensions. And it is only meant to unify the Jews of Egypt who are doing their own thing and building too many different temples and structures. I want to build one temple and it will face Jerusalem. So you could feel what you feel about the legitimacy of that, but certainly they're claiming that this is not a replacement of the Jerusalem temple. All right, let's start with the earlier source. Elephantine, the small little island in the Nile River. In 1908, there was a cache of ancient papyri that was discovered on this little island. And the papyri had all kinds of things, not just Judean texts, but all kinds of very, very ancient archives. And among these many, many texts, there was an archive of somebody named Yedanya. Now, Yedanya is a Hebrew name. And this collection is now called the Yedanya Archive. If you are interested in the Elephantine text, Bezalel Porton has a huge book on the Elephantine papyri, and I highly recommend it. Although there's a lot of reconstruction of letters that's now being debated, but that's kind of like the authoritative work of Elephantine. And Yedanya was apparently someone from the land of Israel. He was a Judean, right? Again, he has a Hebrew name, who was part of a military garrison of Judeans who worked for Persia. So they settled the land maybe in the late 6th century BCE or the 5th century BCE. And we have their writings to Persian authorities. This is just an image of one of the incredible papyri that have been found at Elephantine. Among many documents, I only included the Passover letter, I think, but yeah. But if you read my book that's coming out in 3 weeks, I have a chapter on other letters from Elephantine. So you want to take a look there. But here I just have the Passover letter. This is a very, very famous and controversial letter. Again, recently scholars have said, well, Bezalel Porton has too freely reconstructed the letter because it's very damaged and there's a lot of holes. But according to Porton, this is a letter that the Persians wrote to Yedanya, who's the leader of the Judeans at Elephantine, in response to Yedanya's request about whether they could observe the Passover. And so the Persian authorities, in consultation with Judean leaders, write back to Yadanya and say, yes, here's how you do it. For our purposes, what's interesting is that apparently this Passover holiday would have been celebrated not only the way we do it today, which is, going through our drawers and looking for Cheerios that our kids hid, but it would have been observed with sacrifices, because indeed there is a temple at Elephantine. And here's an image of the excavation. We know from other letters that not only was there a temple at Elephantine that the Judeans built, but it was a temple that was controversial. The Egyptian neighbors of these Judeans did not like this temple and they damaged it. These were the Egyptian priests of Chnum. There's a question of why they were so antagonistic. Is it just because everybody hates the Judeans / Jews, or because these Judeans were sacrificing goats and the Egyptians worshipped the ram, the head of the ram? So there are all kinds of questions about what is going on there. But Yadanya writes about a conflict that culminated in the Egyptians vandalizing their temple, and then to rebuild it, they have to reach out to authorities in Jerusalem and ask for permission to rebuild it. So we have this fascinating cache of papyri found at Elephantine that testify to the existence of a Judean temple in the 5th century BCE. These were people who truly thought that they were observant Judeans, and because they couldn't make it to Jerusalem, right, they were employees of the Persian military who were fighting the Egyptians, they built their own temple. And there's no evidence that they felt that this was anything but an act of piety. Now I'm going to briefly go to the temple of Leontopolis, or what the Mishnah calls Beit Chonya. And we actually don't know if Tel El Yehudiya is the same place as Leontopolis. Modern scholars say maybe not, but traditionally it is. Sort of like, how you might go to a burial place of a medieval rabbi, and then scholars will be like, no, what do you mean? He wasn't buried there. But we just don't know. But the locals for centuries have called this Tel El Yehudiya, right, the site of the Jews. And so tradition has it that that's where the temple of Onias was built. But before we go to this temple and wrap things up, are there any questions? Any questions on Elephantine? Any questions in general? Yes, Saul.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm under the impression that the rabbis have a very ambivalent feeling toward the temple, largely not because of a temple per se, but who's in authority to tell you what to do and how to do it. I mean, most rabbis would be circumspect about Persian authorities telling you if it's okay to sacrifice, but they also wouldn't want to alienate Jews not too far from Israel and Babylon. So
this question, right? This is a massive question. The rabbis ask this question: if you make a vow to bring sacrifice and then you realize you cannot bring it at the Jerusalem temple, is it better to violate the vow to bring a sacrifice or to bring it at the temple of Leontopolis? And the answer, well, there's a debate, but consensus is don't bring it at Leontopolis. It's better to violate your vow. The question,
Right.
the debate is over what punishment you get. Is it karet if you bring a sacrifice at Leontopolis, or is it just a regular punishment, more mild? Yeah.
They also show the sensitivity on the issue of how many people came. They're largely men, which means that the families and the children are left behind.
You mean to Jerusalem?
To Jerusalem. And when the families are left behind, there's even a question of what are they going to survive on if there wasn't enough. And the rabbis seem to be very sensitive to that regarding at least their perspective on pilgrimage.
And certainly, well, we know that some people came alone just because it was hard for children to do it. It was hard for older people to do it. But there was also, there were families who came together. And certainly the rabbis want pilgrimage to happen. They want it to not be financially burdensome. They want it to not be a tircha. They want people to come. And especially knowing that there were Jews who said, wait, why would I go all the way to Jerusalem? I've got Leontopolis a couple kilometers away, actually miles, because, you know, Rome. So a couple miles away. So why would I go all the way to Jerusalem? And this is really unacceptable for the later rabbinic community. It's unacceptable. But at this early stage in the first century BCE, there's much more ambiguity about the status of these temples. Let's do a little bit more and then we'll wrap up. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again. All right, so Josephus, yeah, I don't know that we have so much time to do this, but this is Josephus's account of Onias building that temple in Leontopolis, or maybe near Heliopolis. And according to Josephus, talks about Onias IV, again, who did this in the earlier middle of the 2nd century BCE. Onias is a priest, a pious priest who escapes Jerusalem because Jason and Menelaus, these Hellenized Jews, are trying to kill him. This is kind of the background to much of the Hanukkah story. And Onias comes out looking very good. Ironically, the people controlling the Jerusalem temple at this period are corrupt Hellenized Jews, and the one who escapes is a more pietistic Jew. So we already have a hero, right? And the hero is not the Jews who stay in Jerusalem. The hero is Onias, who comes to Egypt and then says, okay, I'm going to build a temple that's as much that's as close as we can get to the Jerusalem temple. And he even produces vessels, and he really tries to do this. And it says, there's a little bit of a contradiction in Antiquities and the Jewish War in terms of how Josephus interprets this. In the Jewish War, Josephus is a little more cynical about how this is actually a polemical or sort of political maneuver to get followers. So Josephus here says Onias did not do this out of a sober disposition. He had a mind to contend with the Jews at Jerusalem. He could not forget the indignation he had for being banished from there. He wasn't exactly banished, he left, but he ran for his life. Now, again, in Antiquities, the story is slightly different. But here we have maybe I would say a more sympathetic account of Onias. And in Antiquities, we have this letter. Its veracity is disputed. In other words, scholars don't know, is this exactly the original letter that Onias did indeed send to King Ptolemy and Queen Cleopatra? What we have is just what Josephus preserves. And we have this letter in which Onias asked them for permission to build a temple to fulfill the words of the prophet Isaiah, who I don't have this on hand, but there's a pasuk in Isaiah that says that a temple to God will be built by the city of the sun, and Heliopolis is the city of the sun. And so this account of Onias is more sympathetic, and so again, I think it's kind of fun when we have historical ambiguity. We don't know exactly what the motivations of Onias were, but we know that it was built in the early to mid 2nd century BCE. There's even debate about which Onias it was. Was it 3 or was it 4? Was it the father or the son? But we have had there's been some fascinating excavations at Tel El Yehudiyah, vessels that might suggest a Judean presence there that observe some form of purity. Again, this is an open question. And here, Saul, I included the sources in Menachot about Beit Chonia. Chonia, of course, is the Hebrew for Onias, the house of Onias, Beit Chonia. The rabbis, even in the 2nd century, are debating the legitimacy of it, even though the temple likely fell after the Roman war at the end of the 1st century CE. So no one is going to this temple in the 2nd century, but the rabbis are still debating its legitimacy. Okay, bottom line. The bottom line is we have, I wouldn't call it contradictory evidence. I would say evidence that when taken together produce a complex picture. And that is a picture of Jews who are at once deeply and genuinely devoted to the Jerusalem temple. They express this devotion in different ways. Some of them send money. Some of them visit on pilgrimages, right? They have connections that are familial. They have family, they have friends. Does it sound familiar? It's very resonant. They have connections in many different ways to the land of Israel. We don't have a lot of evidence, or any really, that there's a mass wave of immigration, but nevertheless, these Jews are deeply, deeply committed to the land of Israel. Some, not all, but some of these Jews thought the establishment of a temple outside of Jerusalem was a legitimate thing to do, provided that that temple was a kind of inferior replication of the Jerusalem temple, so that those who went there weren't negating the Jerusalem temple. At least that was what the claim was. But you also have figures like Philo, who probably said, no, you can't play that game. There's one temple, read the Bible, there isn't more. You want to go to synagogues? Great. Go to the synagogue, read the Torah, and interpret it. There wasn't normative prayer yet. They went to the synagogues to read the Torah. What you can't do is build a temple. So like today in the 21st century, there is live debate, there is diversity, there is maybe even, I would say, more fluidity than what we find in the later rabbinic era, when there is an active effort to produce a normative system of laws that transcends geographic boundaries. In other words, the rabbis are really interested in cohesion. They want to produce something that can be observed in Jerusalem, in Judea, in Alexandria, and that can obviously has to accommodate the absence of a temple, because the temple has long fallen, at least the only temple that mattered to them. So the rabbis are very interested in cohesion, and therefore such a temple like the one in Leontopolis would be unacceptable to them. In the Second Temple era, you find a little more fluidity. It is a more decentralized culture, or cultures. And I think that this is a good segue to talk about this series in general, because I think we covered a lot and there's also so much more to cover. But I would say, if there's anything that I'd want you to take away from this series, it's that Judaism was not sectarian, as a whole. The vast majority of Jews were not sectarian, but the notion that Jewish identity was associated with a certain set of laws, right? And this is important because we often think of law as sectarian in this context, and we need to separate that, because to be a Jew in the ancient world was to observe a particular set of laws, but it didn't mean that you had to be sectarian. And the nature of those laws and how they interacted and how they were to be practiced, many of these were still live debates, right? Do you fast on Shabbat or do you feast on Shabbat? Do you eat or do you fast? There were all kinds of live debates that end up only reaching a kind of resolution in the 2nd or 3rd century. So I love the Second Temple period, because I think that there's just so much openness and creativity. Of course, there's creativity in the rabbinic era, but it's a different kind. And so with that, I want to make sure we have time for questions and comments. So I'll open that up to conversation now.
I have a question. We have evidence of temples being built in Egypt. We don't have evidence of temples being built in any other diaspora communities, do we? And if so, why Egypt?
It's a hard question to answer. First of all, we're just talking about excavational sites, right? We don't have, unfortunately, access to many, many, many of these ancient sites. And probably, given the state of things, we're not going to be getting that access. So to make an argument from silence, I think would be problematic, because we simply don't know. We know that there were many Jews, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jews in Syria, right to the north, in the region of Antioch. And there could have been something there. We don't know. And yes, you're right. It could very well be that there wasn't a temple there. We don't have the literary evidence for it. I just want to be careful not to say it didn't exist. We know a lot about Egypt, because Egypt was like the New York of the ancient world. Outside of the land of Israel, it had the biggest concentration of Jews anywhere. You're talking up to 1 million Jews in Egypt. There were so many Jews there, and these Jews were establishing various communities in different ways. There were more synagogues than temples, probably. I mean, I think I mentioned to you that Philo says there were synagogues in every section of the city of Alexandria. So if you were a Jew, statistically, it's more likely you would go regularly to the synagogue than to a temple. But I think we have to keep in mind this is a massive community. And we just, on the other hand, so it could be that other temples didn't exist. It could also be we just don't know because we don't have the literature that they produce, and we don't have the excavatory, we don't have the material digs to know.
Ooh, we also have a comment in the chat. Is this a good time?
Yeah, sure. I'm not sure I understand this question. I'm reading it right now.
Okay.
But Ozzy, do you want to share the question? What happened to Ozzy?
Ozzy, I'll promote you as a panelist, or actually I can press allowed to talk if you'd like to talk. No pressure if you don't want to, or you can also clarify as a comment. Oh, there you are. Okay. Why don't you unmute and then you can ask verbally. I sent you an invitation to unmute, Ozzy, so if you want to speak, you just need to accept it.
And actually, I think I can say a little bit on this.
Okay, sounds good.
I'm by no means saying that there is halachic consensus in the rabbinic era. That would be an egregious mistake, right? I mean, all you have to do is look at the Mishnah and study the Talmud to know that it's a multivocal tradition. And I think that the rabbis are very unique in their, in this period, because there's less interest in halachic, what's the word, in homogeny. I don't think that that's the rabbinic project. But there is an interest in communal unity. So I think that we have to separate the discourse of the rabbis, which of course is what we call polyphonic. It has, right, it's multivocal, it has different layers, it has, and it preserves those disagreements because that's a value, right? Shivim Panim Torah, there are infinite examples of the rabbinic interest in preserving those distinctly different voices. But on a communal level, the rabbis are not fans of sectarianism. They don't want a group of Jews to go out on their own and start a new religion, right? That happened with the early Christians. It's not ideal. But in that case, there was no choice because there was such a fundamental disagreement about whether Jesus was Mashiach. But in general, the rabbis want they want a cohesive community. Now, within that community, of course, there could be halachic disagreement, but they also want to have a centralized source of authority, and that would be the rabbinic writers. Any other?
Let me see if we have any questions on Facebook. If you're watching us live on Facebook, feel free to write a question in the chat as well. And anyone who's here with us on Zoom can unmute and ask questions. Okay. I'm gonna check Facebook one more time. All right, so I think we can close for today, right, Dr. Simkovich, if there's no more questions? Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Simkovich, and thank you also to everyone who joined us for this session. Today was the last class of this session, so we will conclude with that. And Sefir Azman is continuing. We have several more classes. If you would like to sign up or find information about schedules, it's available at drisha.org/classes. And again, thank you so much for joining us. And thanks again, Dr. Simkovich, for this interesting session. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all in another date. Lehitraot.
Thank you.
Lehitraot. Thank you.